All right, well, here we are for a impromptu sort of post-mortem of the Asking the Gothic Questions live stream that we just did. I think we can just share some of our... Oh, my hair is all mushed now. Share some of our initial thoughts about how everything went and little comments and things. And then maybe we can kind of skim through some of this and respond, because I think one of the things we had the most fun with, if you watched the live stream, there was a huge chunks where neither of us were talking. So it was kind of like we were kind of doing our own riff track in a way, where somebody would say something questionable.
I mean, because at one point they had said it was nice to see European goth instead of just English and American goth, Anglo-American.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, that wasn't, I mean, I think I made the comment to Danny that, baby steps, right?
Yeah.
Before it's just Anglo-American, now it's Anglo-American and the continent. So we're spreading. So it's nice to see some of that representation, but they are at least acknowledging it more, which is a step in the right direction at the very least.
General thoughts, it was... so just I'll share my subjective experience of it and you can share yours. So leading up to it, the last 2-3 weeks, I had incredible anxiety. The only way I could really manage that was to make notes they gave us like the 4 main bullet points they wanted to talk about. So the only way that I could manage my anxiety around sort of public speaking in front of not just an audience, but in front of people that I respect, like Catherine Spooner. I have her books. I've been reading her books for years. Lisa, I hadn't known of, but she's doing really, really cool things with the London Youth Culture Museum, and I really respect that. The moderator, whose name I forgot, unfortunately.
Emma, I believe was her name.
Emma. Doing incredible work. Kevin... Nick. I can't understand. I can't remember names. Nick, I had heard of, and I think I had watched 1 or 2 YouTube videos of him in the past. But like, again, professor who knows a bunch of shit. Mel is somebody that I like a lot, and we've had her on a podcast before. Mm-hmm. So like, I just, and it's a museum. So, and I have watched a lot of these panel presentations for various different formats, different topics. And the idea of being included on one, even if it wasn't like, oh, here's an expert in a topic, even if it was just like, let's have this idiot who's just a normal goth talk about goth, put so much pressure on me. So I had like a 12-page document of, here are the things I can talk about. So leading up to it, I was terrified. Before we started, we had like 20 minutes of pre-show where we were all in the room virtually, and there was some like banter and jokes and stuff, and that was fun. And then they didn't get to us for like 40 minutes during the live stream. When they did finally get to us and they asked the first question, which they asked me about gender, I was feeling fine up until she said my name, and then I had to talk, and I could feel my chest like expanding and contracting about 2 inches more than it had been, and my heart was going like slamming into my chest.
His heart grew 5 times that day.
Yeah. I do love Christmas. That did go away, but I don't think I was basically anxious through that whole thing, especially because of the format, and there were so many people and the time was limited. Topics kept coming up that I was like, I could add something to this, and that could be expanded on, and that could be expanded on. And so as the conversation is going in my head, every time somebody brings up a subject, I'm trying to think, okay, what do I have to say about this? If they say, what do you think about this? And so it was really difficult to continually switch between topics in my brain, just because that's just the way my brain works. But overall, it was less stressful than I thought it was going to be. I thought the moderator everybody said the moderator did an incredible job. And I feel like we almost need to do we're going to skim through this video a little bit, but I feel like we almost need to do a watch party to comment on the things being said, because I had some things to say. But that's just my experience of being at the event. So, and then we'll get into other stuff, but
we could maybe do a bigger watch party like we do the riff tracks and have some other people in just to kind of do some commentary. Yeah. Just treat it like we did the movies.
That could be fun. Yeah, I could try and organize that.
So actually, my experience.
Ask in chat while we.
That could be a good experience. So, my experience was pretty similar. I care less, I guess, about my public-facing image, so I don't get as nervous as Danny does. But it was definitely, this is a big step up in prestige as far as things I've been involved with. So it was very both exciting and nerve-wracking at the same time. And I know when Danny first mentioned it to me, he was kind of floating it as, do you want to do this instead of me?
Yeah, I said.
And I was a little like, am I willing? Yes. But do I think I'm the best person to do that? Absolutely not. So I told Danny that, yeah, I'd be willing to do that if they're willing to have me, but I still think they would be the best person to address these topics, and I offered to be there, even if they didn't allow me as a guest. They ended up allowing that, obviously, but we weren't sure initially whether I would be allowed. But I figured, it's a live stream. If he just needs me there as his support animal, that's fine. I could just stand under his desk and cuddle up against his legs and stroke my hair and be comforted by that. So I sort of felt that was my role, but
I didn't want to. I wanted you. You have lots of important things to say, so I wanted you to be there to also help. Yes, it did help calm me down, but I wanted you to be able to have a voice in that conversation because you always have good stuff to talk about.
Yeah, I'm definitely glad I got the opportunity to participate, and I thought I did have some interesting points that I made, and apparently both the chat and at least some of the other people on the panel were either being very polite or agreeing and saying that, I was making some interesting points. So, it was overall, it was pleasantly cordial, the entire conversation. Yeah. It was a lot of people that were respecting each other's space.
Except for Kevin, who was like, I have something to say.
Yes.
Once or twice.
And Danny, who insists on getting Nick's name wrong constantly.
Nick, fuck, what is wrong with me? Somebody on that note,
right there.
Somebody in Discord made this GIF of Nick, which I thought was funny.
But yeah, so I think it was a really good experience. Like Danny said, the moderator did an excellent job. It was comforting to me that it was a highly moderated discussion where people were generally being called upon rather than that sort of free-for-all you can sometimes get, usually with poor moderation, but even sometimes with good moderation. They open it up for comments back and forth. I'd actually just watched a roundtable discussion on YouTube that was a total mess. It was fascinating, but it was a hot mess, and it was, of course, on things regarding post-capitalist commodification and all kinds of fun little economic topics and things like that. But it had a variety of voices from various liberal and conservative kind of YouTube think tanks, for lack of a better term, because they weren't like high-level professional people, but people who have significant platforms doing this discussion. And there was a lot of sort of talking over one another. Some people who were very clearly just taking the piss out of one another and felt like they were just, the whole straw manning and all that fun stuff. So that was sort of the bad example of something that I enjoyed watching because it had some interesting things, but it was a hot mess where this was well structured. The only thing frustrating, of course, about it being well structured is due to limitations of time and the impression of the moderator who's determining who gets to speak. There were instances where Danny or I may have had something to say or wanted to have something to say. There was no real way, at least that we were shown and were aware of, that we could make it known other than unmuting our mics and blurting something out, which is a point of etiquette that nobody broke. So I'm glad that we weren't the only ones who broke it at any point either.
And incredibly well produced too. Really impressed. I mean, I guess you would expect that for a design museum, but very well put together.
It is very good. It's their design decision. I hate the line going down the center of their webpage, and it's in the
Yeah, I
live stream
do
as well
too.
because
What
it
the
goes
fuck
right through
is
the middle
that?
of words.
Yeah.
And it drives me up the wall. I hated it on the webpage, and it doesn't bother me as much on the live stream because usually it's covered up by a solo person, and it's also is an even division between two pictures when two people are up there, but it still cuts the title and not even like evenly. It's slightly off. So I guess it is right over the I, isn't it? But that N and den is bugging me.
Yeah.
So there are aspects of that particular design decision that bugged me from the first time I went to their website. But, design's a personal thing.
And, I like, oh, is it gone now?
What an emotional journey.
That's a different, I do have, so like, I don't know if it'll necessarily come up in this. What I want to do is try and find a few different clips that we can listen to and maybe comment on them.
Yeah.
Of the topics I wanted to cover that we didn't cover, because again, there were many moments that came up where both Trey and I were like, that person just said something that I would definitely like to talk about, and you have to move on, and it's like that could become another 30-minute discussion. I'm going to try and incorporate some of that into either this next podcast episode or the podcast episode after that, because I put so much time into thinking about this stuff that it's like we'll bring it up. The one thing I can remember at the very end that I wanted to comment on was about the guy who put the thing together that was there.
Tomas.
That he didn't talk at all, basically, but then he said something about on the heels of can goth still be subversive, and then he said it seems like goth is going mainstream, and I think Catherine mentioned the sort of articles about goth being used in the mainstream. My thought, the thing I wanted to say about the subversion of goth was this is the name of the document I made because I was so angry that I agreed to do this, that it was why am I doing this. That part I wanted to get into the sort of fact that goth is, and I've talked about that on the podcast before, but that goth is subversive because you are in the world bringing forth an alternative way of being which creates material change. When I go out dressed as a goth, it might elicit in other people thoughts of, some people might think of death, right? And so they're thinking about, why is this person dressed like they're going to a funeral, or thoughts of the process of dying, or thoughts of mortality. That is something that is political. I didn't even get to do the Carol Hanges quote of the personal is political, but that's something that's like, assisted suicide or funeral homes. Those are things that are legislated. Or if I go out, maybe reactions from other people may be related to like moral objections of bodily autonomy or modesty or, gender. We did talk about gender. That is part of that sort of interactive bringing forth of the self, and that itself is subversive because you're presenting a different way of being than what other people would like to normalize, or even if depending on what band shirt I'm wearing or what patches I'm wearing on my vest, there might be explicit political statements, or there might be like philosophical statements. Those kinds of things go out and interact with in the world, which makes it subversive. And the point there is that you cannot decouple the political from identity and from subculture. The thing that I wanted to bring up briefly to Catherine's point is what I wrote here about the sort of articles you see running on mainstream websites. And that's a whole other thing about who owns the platforms that people talk on, who's doing the algorithms, right? TikTok has been accused of social engineering their algorithms to promote certain types of trends and so that's a whole other question about ownership, and like that gets even into communism and some of those kinds of things. But I feel like the one way of viewing these articles about goth, Kim Kardashian going goth, is to view it as recuperation, which I don't think anybody has really talked about that I've seen. Essentially, the idea is that because goth is subversive, then the ruling class tries to reclaim or recuperate the narrative of what goth is by aligning it with market values, spending capital, and celebrity excess, which moves subcultural transgression away from new ways of being in the world or from working class solidarity towards something that's mediated and moderated by capitalism. So that's something I wanted to throw in, but we didn't have time, so I just went straight to talking about music because I thought we just should talk about music. But there's a bunch of stuff like that happened that I think we could have gone off on tangents on. And it was also funny watching, I didn't watch too many of their reactions, but they obviously were marginalizing, like, here are these two morons, like, we'll put them, they're not important, like, which is fine, like, we're not published authors, whatever.
I mean, compared to the company we're keeping, we were pretty much lowest on the totem pole, both because of, for those who weren't published authors per se, we didn't have the age also to have lived in at least around the inception, like Mel had. But yeah, we weren't published authors. We weren't accredited academicians. We didn't work in the industry. We haven't presented at other museums before. We haven't curated our own public exhibitions apart from our own bodies as a public exhibition. So it's fair that we were not necessarily being treated to the same degree, but I thought they treated us quite well, even given that. They did acknowledge us as, I mean, they were lumping everybody together when they were talking about a panel of experts. They didn't say a panel of experts and some guests and some Americans know about the scene. So we were included in that, and so I didn't necessarily feel that we were outsiders, and maybe the amount of being called on reflected some of that, but I don't even know if it did, because I felt that we were oftentimes called on.
Well, that's what I think.
At points when we were
relevant,
most obviously relevant, and that's sort of the key, is that they were choosing on when we're obviously relevant rather than when we are possibly relevant. But there's a fine line you need to do when you're moderating that, because sometimes you do have people who are expert in certain topics, and you want to give them the most time because of their expertise. And while some other person might have valid points, it's a gamble. And as a moderator, you don't know that, and you don't want to just spend the time to discover whether it was a good gamble or a bad gamble.
I do really wish that when I did get to put in that little bit of commentary about the Gothic and binaries, I wish that Catherine or Nick had been able to, or had responded in some way, because I would have liked to have heard either,
to have a dialogue.
That's very insightful, or actually, that's completely wrong, let me tell you why, just because, like, I don't know anything about the Gothic. But what I was going to say was, by the time they did get to us and we had that first little block of conversation, I felt like the perception of us as guests on the panel did shift, and they started saying our names more, and it felt to me, and again, I haven't watched it yet, so I don't know, but it felt to me like they had the, like, oh, these people have something to say, and I respect that more, and I feel like we kind of won them over, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see where that feeling would come from. I think we did, to some degree.
But again, I'm going to sit down and watch it with a critical eye and see all the things that I don't like. But let's see. You have any other thoughts about? Let's see. Anything in general?
Well, what were you? I'm trying to now remember what you just were. You went on a big thing about in your response, and I'm trying to remember what you were discussing. What were you just responding to?
About the recuperation of...
That's right, about the goth being capitalism. Subversive. I mean, I did want to echo what I've echoed multiple times on the podcast, that I don't think goth's reason to exist is to be subversive, is to be a force for change, whatever society is. Goth, has its sort of idea of how things should be, and because there is a disconnect between society as we now experience it and how at least the consensus, as fuzzy as that may be amongst goth as a whole, of how we think the world should be, because there's a disconnect there. We are, as Danny said, simply by existing being subversive, because we are acting as we think things should be. That diverges from what society currently has as its consensus. But unlike a subculture, or the stereotypical counterculture that is counterculture by just being counter, if we lived in a world that changed to more closely match the goth consensus ideal, goth would not be forced to change, because we are, by design, we have to be contrary. We're not a contrarian subculture. So whether we're subversive or not is not really germane to the existence of goth. But because we are subversive, it's good that we have our voices, and it's good we use our voices, because we do see problems in the world. We do think there are issues that need to be addressed, and we choose to address those rather than choosing to pretend they're not there, rather than burying our heads in the sand and going totally private and pretending society doesn't exist, and we all become little hermits in our bat caves, and be goth all amongst ourselves. And there are certainly people in the Gothic subculture who are more comfortable in that, and that's okay. But as long as we have some members of the subculture who are willing to take that stand, it makes it better for all of us, even those who do want to not have that fight because they're not comfortable with it or whatever. Not everybody is confrontational, and that's okay.
That was, I think, the one point that I could have gotten into a debate, which I didn't because I wanted to avoid it. And I did address it at some point, but just kind of in a circumspect way, was the Mel describing her identity as a personal thing. Because the argument would have been that I think the problem that arose in the 90s with a more neoliberal ethic was the notion of a goth identity being this essentialist, immutable, irreducible essence that you then externalize, and it is a very individualized thing, which in my mind is sort of a conservative or neoliberal ideology, because it's the personal responsibility argument. The things that happen in your life are your responsibility, and not, it divorces the individual from the community. And so I wanted to argue that goth is co-constructed, co-created, and something that is, even if you feel like your personal identity is something of your own and you're kind of isolated, it's actually not. You may experience it that way, but it is extended into the world around you, and the things that you touch and the things that you do in the world around you don't exist in a vacuum. The clothing that you buy, the ephemera, they brought up skulls, the ephemera that you buy and that you have around your house, the music you listen to, all of those things are touched and informed by local, national, and international culture, the norms and values and expectations of the person that created those things, that then change and interact with the community that inserts their own interpretations of those things on them. And so I don't think it is possible to have that essentialist, individualized identity, and even though it may intuitively feel that way, that's not how it is. And so I didn't get into a direct, I didn't want to because again, anytime you're the way you think about your identity is wrong, that's never going to go well, right? So I tried to, and I wish I had more time to do it, because I had this whole thing. A lot of what I talked about in the Internet Hasn't Killed Goth video about how I see identity construction happening through an embedded, embodied, extended, and an active perspective, and through Dr. Mueller's second order observation stuff. I tried to put some of that into there with some practical examples, but it was kind of a jumble, and I wish we had more time to talk about it, but that's just kind of how it goes. Yeah,
I mean, kind of dovetailing off of that same thing as you were talking about the identity being this dialogue between the location, the culture, and the location, and the the space you're inhabiting and your own personal interaction with it, that dialogue is important, because a lot of what they were talking about when it comes to subversion or some of the things were, like you mentioned, the skull. Mm-hmm. That's a superficial artifact of one interpretation of the Gothic.
Yeah.
But having a bear skull around in America or the UK or Europe is going to hit very differently than having a skull sitting around in, say, Mexico.
Yeah.
Or wearing black and being westernized funerary tradition is going to hit very differently in China, where it doesn't have the same associations. Or doing seances and communing with ghosts. Again, Eastern cultures have a much different attitude towards ancestors and ghosts in their history as well. So it doesn't hit the same. So what is Gothic as far as what are those liminal spaces, and what are those places of darkness that most people as a part of that culture choose not to look at? Well, in America, we might be afraid to go into cemeteries because they're haunted, scary places, where they're a place of celebration in Mexico and Colombia and things like that. So these artifacts are also culturally specific. So saying goth is picnics in a cemetery and having bear skulls and dressing in black, that's a what? It does a good job of sort of defining the superficial artifacts for a specific location and place, but it doesn't answer the why. There's an underlying question of why do goths focus on these things, and how does it hit? And that is a dialogue with the underlying culture, that individual member who's choosing those pieces of ephemera, that it's a reflection of that culture, and it'll change in different cultures. So goth does look different as it migrates around the world, because it has a different culture it's grabbing upon. And all cultures have things that are, to the culture as a whole, best left aside, best left not looked at, best left not illuminated. That's kind of my impression of the darkness, is the things that society chooses not to illuminate. And that varies from culture to culture. And so a reflection of goth, if it focuses more on we are choosing to illuminate and engage with those dark aspects of our culture, is going to cause goth, from a superficial third-party perspective, to look different as it moves around, unless you understand the underlying cultural conceits that it is speaking to and or speaking against.
And I mean, I think even more. Sorry, is that your phone?
That probably was. Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's like, are we being abducted? Even more niche than that, right? Because you can have, even among goths, like, depending on the context, where you're at, who you're around, a skull, whatever iconography, can take on different meanings and different engagements and actions depending on who's there and where you are. You take it between a goth club and a rave, or wherever, or just a small group of friends here in this room. Whereas if we were to go walk to the cemetery down the street and bring a skull with a candle and light it and have a conversation, that may take on a very different meaning in that context. So it is, I think it is that talking about the importance of the reciprocal interaction between organisms and the world, and that you cannot, just like I think you can't decouple politics from culture and identity. I don't think you can decouple. That's what embedded means, is you are the world and the agent do not make sense apart from one another. You cannot examine them separately. The world doesn't exist and you interact with it. The world exists because we interact with it. So those two things need to be there. And then just one of the things that came up in my mind that I'm still kind of not sure on, but was a initial critique of the this exhibit, was some of the images I was seeing from. I don't have the book. There was a book that they gave out for the exhibit, and people were sending me photos of the more egregious images in there, and there were things like Elvis and the Statue of Liberty and just like weird dark black and white photographs and things that have absolutely nothing to do with goth. And then
Things that would have needed a ton of context to even be remotely considered part of it. You'd have to have a whole paragraph of explanation of, how does this answer the whys of goth?
Yeah, and even in the museum, like H.R. Giger stuff and whatever exhibit, like, things that they had there that felt to me like, here is a top-down academic perspective of... I actually, at a lot of points, I like the way Catherine explained, at least she explicitly stated that when we're talking about goth, we're talking about from like late 70s onward. When we're talking about the Gothic, we're talking about this period of time. I'm very glad she made that distinction, because sometimes in academic circles I see the intention being a continual line. And even there is that, I don't remember what YouTube channel did it. It was like a bigger YouTube channel that had like 25 million views, where they like, here's the Visigoths and this is where goth started. And then we have, and that was a thing that I was going to go off on if that became a topic. But that's kind of what, as someone who wasn't there, right? So like,
right.
It gave off some of those vibes of like, this is dark and spooky, it's goth,
Mm-hmm.
So that I was a little worried about that, but
yeah, kind of dovetailing off of something you were saying earlier that got me into thinking about, again, about how goth is different to Gothic, different people in different spaces. We had that discussion about identity, and they brought up the concept of the weekender goth, and what is sort of that debate about authenticity, right? That oftentimes happens.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, as they already discussed, in their identity is fluid. People have multiple identities, but that's not necessarily even a goth thing. That's just a human thing. We all have different identities based on location and circumstance. You are not the same person at Thanksgiving dinner as you are at a club, as you are at your job, as you are riding public transit, or as you are singing in the shower alone at home. These are all different hats we put on, and people move through these spaces and move through different contexts, and their identity changes. Again, a lot of that's from sort of a superficial presentation display perspective, because in theory, at least, core identity, which is oftentimes hard for anybody to even sort of quantify or even to speak to. I mean, I can give vague impressions about who I am on the inside, but I think almost everybody who lives, part of living is the constant search for finding all those nooks and crannies of who you are, who as an individual each person is. And that's kind of the goal of all living sentient beings, at least. Since that's part of
I would
what
argue
makes
all
sentience.
organisms use some form of semiosis, but that's like a different...
Fair. I mean, we used to oftentimes define sentience as being a self-reflective, and I'm talking specifically self-reflective qualities. Now, that's not to say other living beings don't have that, and we just don't understand how they do it, or that they do it. This is not to put human, quote-unquote, sentience above other life forms.
Yeah.
But as we define sentience...
Anthropocentrism is the word.
Yes, it is anthropocentrism. So as we anthropocentrically define sentience, it is that ability to self-reflect. And most of us anthropocentrically self-reflective individuals spend our entire life...
Such a mouthful.
It's a fun mouthful, though.
Yeah.
We spend our entire lives on this quest to find ourselves, and people are refinding themselves and rediscovering themselves, and there's midlife crises and end-of-life crises and end-of-life epiphanies and all these things that happen. So individually, our conception of ourselves changes, but in the instant, at least, people do voluntarily change how they present their identity, their constructed identity, their outward-facing identity constantly. And it's something we also discuss when we talk about diversity too, the concept of code switching, when you have not only just different situational things all within a single cultural context, but when you're having to go between multiple cultural contexts as well. If you have a home life that is, say, a traditional Chinese family from a first generation immigrant family, and you go home and you're in this very Chinese or Japanese or Taiwanese or whatever world of that first immigration family, and then you go into your job, which is a standard American business job or something, and you have to do this code switching of every part of your identity, every part of your presentation, language, bearing, demeanor, emphasis, how you address people and how you respect certain individuals, all that changes. And, I can only understand that to some degree from hearing other people's, discussions of it, because I do have the privilege of having grown up in a family that is part of this culture, that I also work in this culture and inhabit this culture because I've always lived in the same country within the same cultural umbrella as myself, my parents, my grandparents, and their parents. I'm pretty sure it goes at least that far back. But even with that, I know there was a difference between, how do you act around your grandparents versus how do you act around your parents and things like that as those cultural norms change and you need to adapt or choose not to adapt. And all of that is your choice in your identity because, not conforming to those expectations and being the black sheep of the family or being the cultural outcast who chooses not to be part of whatever that culture in that area is its own choice and has its detriments and rewards, and that's just is also part of your being and identity is how you choose to navigate that.
The example I use is I think we understand implicitly that identity is not static because if you meet up with a friend that you haven't seen for a few years, what's the first thing you do? You ask them what's been going on in your life. And that's sort of a way of orienting ourselves to who is this person compared to the person that I knew, because we just implicitly understand that identity is where we are bringing it forth. It is not something that exists. Well, like it's not, if you want to do a biological determinism, your cells regenerate every 7 years. So that's, that's out the window. If it's a memory theory, then what, did you not exist before your first memory? And then also we know the way memory works is that it's every time you have a memory, it's a reconstruction. It's not like playing a tape back. It's you're changing details. You're remembering it the way you want to remember it. It's not some mechanistic process. So
you're playing the tape back, but you also have the right head engaged. So you're also kind of writing over.
You have to be old to know what that to get that reference.
That's fair, but
I don't know what the digital version of that would be. But yeah, so those are some general thoughts. Let's see if I want to see if I can skip through this video and find a few things that we can hear and respond to. Again, this would be more efficient if I had sat down and actually made some timestamps, but we won't take too much longer.
I mean, this is an immediate response, and
yeah.
Like I said, if we choose to do a more formalized one, maybe we will do something like that.
Yeah. Or, whatever, this kind of thing, we'll roll it into a podcast. I might, if I have the time, be writing an article for Auxiliary Magazine about this experience. I don't know. Oh, my spouse is asking me to finish. Do you need me? I think something is going on. Also, I wonder, I'm going to check this video back and see and talk to you if maybe this is something you'd feel comfortable just putting on the YouTube page, or if you'd rather keep it just for Patreon, but we can have that conversation later.
I have no problem putting anything and everything out in the public. There's nothing that I care that, I mean, there is a point, and the business side is sort of your domain, but there's a point to making things special for the Patreon so they have a reason to.
Well, it would
Patreon.
be like early access if I decided to put it up. I just want to make sure.
No, there's nothing that when I record myself on the internet, I have no illusion that this is somehow magically private, but also out there. That just is a ridiculous belief that I'm of the right age to hold that belief, but I choose not to.
Just checking to see if everything is okay. Well, let me see if I can I skipped past the intro stuff because there's no real meat there. Let's see what is going on at this point.
It is,
Kevin
in
talking?
fact, I got a little
Yes,
bit
this
earlier.
is
Nick.
Nick, definitely not
So when I
Kevin.
would sort of date goth beginning as a recognisable form in 1979 with Bauhaus releasing Bela Lugosi's Dead, which they actually recorded about 3 miles from where I grew up. But I think that there's a little
Major goth
prehistory
points,
to
Nick.
the goth movement, which would take in
There was a lot of name dropping.
Alice Cooper, bands like Black
But
Sabbath,
that's fine.
No, it is
obviously
fine.
the Damned, but in
it's
fact
cultural
principally
capital,
the
right?
Doors, who did describe their
Another thing
music,
we didn't talk
as,
about that I
as
was ready to
Gothic.
talk about.
So you get this lead in. And the late 70s were a very exciting time for youth culture and in pop and rock music, and particularly for developing
Did kind of want to have a
alternative
discussion with
lifestyles.
Lisa about youth culture and what makes something youth culture versus culture.
Yeah, well,
What would be an adult culture? I mean, what is adult subculture?
it's
Is it
always
even
been a
thing?
stupid distinction. That was something that existed primarily, I think, in sociology because of the way they viewed subcultures as like this post World War II era. And I think people like Muggleton and others were sort of like, hang on now, we're setting up these false dichotomies that don't actually exist. I was kind of bummed out at some point somebody mentioned Hebdige because I think Hebdige's approach through the CCCS of the sort of understanding culture through sartorial iconography, having fixed meanings that are transgressive to a mainstream, has been largely like rejected, and I have many problems. I could talk another 30 minutes about that. So I was kind of bummed that like that guy came up because of all the theorists that talk about subculture you could mention, he's the one that I would least care. I mean, obviously he had a big influence on stuff, but to speak to the aging thing, like I think academically we've been slow, or they have been slow to make that change, but there are books now like this, Aging in Youth Cultures, and there are papers and stuff that have come out sort of acknowledging like, yeah, this is not a youth phenomenon. He just said something there I wanted to respond to, and now I don't remember what it was. No, I don't remember, so that's fine, whatever.
And many of the bands that have since been retrospectively made part of the goth canon were at the time considered to be quite different. So I'm thinking about bands such as Joy Division,
Yeah,
for
so
example.
do you have
This
any
point before.
thoughts on this?
I mean, I've definitely made this point before on the podcast that when we're talking about, usually it's the topics of, I don't want to be goth, or I can't be goth, or goth can't be this because I don't like this music. And the question is, well, what music are you talking about, right?
Yeah.
The question is, which goth musics? And there is this big umbrella of things that are at least considered recommended listening for those who are involved in the goth subculture, right? They're not all necessarily considered goth bands, and I also do have disagreements with people around, what makes something a goth band. Is it who does it? Is it how they do it? Is it how it sounds? Is it how it's made? Is it what impact that person or that song has on the community? And it's a mix of all these things, but there's arguments to be made about goth as a musicological term that's based on, doing an analysis of it from a abstract musical standpoint regarding instrumentation, regarding sonic texture and use of timbre, regarding scale and harmony and rhythm and all these concepts that you use to analyze music in a music theory concept. Mm-hmm. And that's one way of looking at it. And you can define or try to define goth in that way. But you could also define goth in the way of, well, this is goth because it's subjectively, it's talking about topics that are goth, even if it doesn't necessarily sound goth. Mm-hmm. But the subject matter is goth, the lyrical content is goth, or the people who make it are goth. And then it goes the other way too. Something that sounds goth, well, does that make the people who made it goth?
Yeah.
Whether they want to be or not, they are automatically because they happen to make something that fits a sonic archetype, or happen to grab the attention of people who consider themselves masters of the goth canon within the subculture. And there's a whole dialogue around that I can't even necessarily put a concrete definition down because I'm conflicted about it myself, and I think a lot of people are. It's complicated to go with that because it is such a being so identity based and being so sort of individualism being so rarefied within it is making these sort of concrete distinctions more difficult.
Well, I like what he said about, the goth canon being negotiated. That's something we talked a lot about in our episode on Italian goth, so I won't necessarily go into that again. And also that embedded in that is the idea that, like, goth didn't become fully formed. It was this weird artistic movement. You didn't even have people using the term goth until the late 80s, early 90s regularly. You had, like, people were new wavers, the morbids, bats, new romantics, wavers, cureheads. You had all these disparate terms depending
Darks, gloomies.
Yep, depending on where you were from. And, the thing with music is it's not... and I always argue this because people say goth is just music. But music is not just the tone and timbre and musicological definition. It is influenced by philosophies and the backgrounds of the musicians and the context that the music is being consumed in, and the current cultural climate, and all, the atmosphere and all of that shapes the music. The lyrics often talk, we didn't get into the examples, but in our episode last year about that we did about the Gothic, I had a whole thing where I talked about, here are all the, like, Bauhaus 1919. The 1919 was the year that the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was released. Susie and the Banshees came from a Gothic film called Cry of the Banshee. Like, all of these Gothic influences and beyond, not just goth, right, obviously, but you have all these influences going into the music, which means it is not just, oh, I listen to goth music and that's goth, because there's more going on there in the background. Anyway, let's see if we can skip to somebody else. There's Mel. Mel was talking about her images, which was quite lovely.
The first Gothic novel.
Here we go, Catherine. Let's see what Catherine has to say.
Gothic is usually thought by critics to have begun in the 18th century. And the first Gothic novel is usually agreed to be The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, which was published in 1764. But
yes, and this part was, I think I even brought this up in a podcast. This is something she talks about at length in the Contemporary Gothic book about, and actually, I'm just going to skip this because I think she's going to talk about this a lot at her talk tomorrow.
Probably, yeah.
So, but I think she makes a great point, and it's really interesting, and you should either read that book, or you should have already watched this live stream, or watched her other interview that's coming up. So let's see if we can skip to something else. That is not us.
Historical novels, but even in recent, for example, North American fiction, such as Toni Morrison's work, which is looking back at the American experience, particularly of slavery. And, this is something which, is a history that cannot and should not be forgotten, but at the same time, it's very difficult to express it. And so it can only be done obliquely and through supernatural or mythological or folkloric ways.
Another idea of engaging with darkness,
so the Gothic novel becomes a very powerful way
that which is sinister
of dealing with the guilt, the anxiety, and the horror of what it is to live in a consumerist, capitalist, industrial and technological society, as Britain was in the 19th century.
I think I was like cheering at this point when he said
this.
I skipped part of what he
Catherine
said, but like that was such a great.
So that's also an expression of this burden of history, right? So this history that is not letting go, that is persisting, and actually the past being incredibly present, and yeah, you don't have to put your finger out.
That's absolutely right.
Can I come in there?
Sure.
I think what. I absolutely agree.
Also, is he wearing, what is that?
And I think just going back
is that
to
like a smoking
your
jacket or a robe?
It
looks really
obvious
comfortable.
Answer there, in that this is a particular decade of
could be a smoking jacket. I mean, it looks like it's got some sort of a
capitalism run wild
monogram or some sort of stitching on the
sense that you're getting from the Gothic, from
Very
that
fancy.
needing to kind of come to terms with history
Could just be a
is
fancy
a
sport
really
coat, though, too.
good way of dealing with that. And in Britain, the rise of Goth is exactly coextensive with Margaret Thatcher's rise to power. So they both came in 1979. I don't think that's a coincidence.
No,
I think
exactly.
that's quite right.
Bonnie in the U.S.
At the same time, I think that there's a sense among the youth that they deserve to have a voice, and that if rock and roll is going to be something which is topical.
Again, it's not just the youth who want a voice. Everybody wants to have a voice.
It shouldn't be a lot of old rockers who are doing it. There's Roger Daltrey. I hope I die before I get old.
Like,
well,
just
no,
because it was the adults that were in power. There were plenty of adults that were like, let's murder Ronald Reagan, please. He's a fucking piece of shit.
Right. Though it is oftentimes societally left up to the youth who, I don't know whether it's a sense that adults feel that youth don't have as much to lose, so they can be this sort of point of friction because they don't have this steady job and this family and all these accumulated comforts that you risk when you go putting yourself out there to be, revolutionary. But frankly, if we left everything up to the youth, our country probably would still be British, because it was people of all ages that had that particular revolution, for better or for worse, and a lot of things like that, a lot of revolutions, whether it was that or whether it was the, kicking back against slavery, the dissolution of empire historically, a lot of that happened. Yes, were there youth voices who were speaking out? Certainly. But it takes the will of a whole society. You can't leave everything up to just the kids, especially since the kids, while being willing to speak out, also have the least agency. They have the least ability to make change. They can make noise and hopefully guilt the people who have power and can make change into doing so. But, as we already see in today's delightful political climate, how, it's left up to some of the younger members of our government to be agitators, and they are pretty much resoundingly dismissed by the older establishment as being, oh, they're just kids and they don't know any better. So we'll let them have their tantrums, and then they'll grow up and understand that the way that I'm comfortable with is the best way because I'm right. So there's a lot of that dismissal, and I think as a society we do kind of leave things up to the kids a little too much. And I can't personally claim to be completely immune from that impulse too, because it's harder, or at least it feels harder as you get older, because I don't feel like I have as much time to engage with that sort of stuff as I did when I was in college or in high school and things like that.
No, I have 3 jobs. I can't
And
I love learning about Marxist theory, but when the fuck do I have time to sit down and do this and then change that into practice? I mean, that's part of what the podcast is about, is let's have these conversations. Hopefully that will encourage engagement, but that's also why I wanted to, and I didn't get to this in the thing, but I think it's important to encourage local action, to get to know the people around you, find a group of people, and then make change rather than being overwhelmed by the immensity of all of this stuff. What are you looking at?
I think it's actually a pocket square.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
A pocket square in the
and what a
there.
beautiful library he has back there. I wish, I tried to get my books in the shop, but it doesn't matter anyway. It gets put to shame by that absolutely gorgeous collection.
He hasn't done. Yeah. So there's a sense that the whole rock scene has become rather vampiric, feeding off the new blood to keep the older generation going. And so, although it claims to be
that he's saying there with the new blood feeding off the old has become kind of a thing in. I watch a lot of music review YouTubers and stuff like that too. They're about music in general, and there is a thing going around now about how old music is sort of coming back in a way that's supplanting new music. A lot of people are going back and listening to, and some of it is TikTok, and TikTok memes are introducing people to Fleetwood Mac or to Genesis or some of these old bands from the 60s or 70s. And there's also a giant whole subgenre of YouTube that I quite love, which are reaction videos of people, young people who grew up listening to, one type of music, whether it was boy bands or pop groups or just rap or just jazz, and then discovering, 40s and 50s jazz and torch songs and old 70s R&B or funk or 80s music, and just falling in love with all these things. Like, I never heard any of this stuff growing up because I only listened to stuff that is post 2000s because that's all my family listened to. And there's this idea now that people are discovering it. And this is probably one of those things thanks to the internet and streaming media and not having to buy and not being so beholden on the constant churn of the popularity contests of radio or MTV, things like that, as your only music discovery source, having all of this music available. And all of a sudden people are discovering stuff that's old, and some people are using it as a way to dig into that older technology, and some people are bringing it into our modern day remix culture and creating new things out of it, like synthwave being made out of old 80s soundtracks, and a lot of modern hip-hop, well, not even modern hip-hop historically has been through the DJ element of hip-hop, grabbing from old soul and R&B and funk and heck, even metal and rock and pop records from decades prior. So it's interesting that sort of remix culture has become so much the norm. And so looking back and looking at old culture, it's a mix, but there's definitely a sort of sky is falling attitude in both directions, really, because there's definitely, I've watched some YouTubers who are sort of older guard, and they're like, new music is killing everything because it's not about lyrical concepts or rich melodies. It's a lot of one-note things, a lot of very rhythmic, and there's the underlying racism of music without harmony and melody isn't actually music.
Yeah.
Or just this one-note rhythmic singing that some of the songs by like Taylor Swift would be doing is not as good as this arcing Simon and Garfunkel dual harmony melody thing that they'll do. And this is something that's been, it's a constant push and pull historically, because you make the same arguments if you look at, people in Mozart's time, looking back at the complicated Baroque music of Bach and those fugues and these simple little ditties that this young whippersnapper Mozart's twiddling around on his piano, and this populist opera that's done in German. Who does opera in German? That's the language of the people. It should be classical Latin or Italian, where proper high art is. And it's been going on forever, and I'm sure it was going on in ancient Greek times and Mesopotamian music, and who knows, you can go as far back, and there's always been a ebb and flow of music emphasizing different elements and what is important and what makes something musical, and everybody thinks that their music is the best, and it's a ridiculous debate.
There is I'll point people to, I'll put it in the YouTube comments because I'm going to absolutely butcher trying to remember. I have a mind addled by ADHD and my memory sucks. But they spoke to something very similar in a panel that Lisa was on with a few PhD candidates. And one of the people had done a documentary about two different genres of music that were based in England among Black communities. And I can't even remember the name of the genres. But there were like two new genres, completely new genres that became really popular.
Grime, maybe one of them?
Yes, grime, and then there was another one. And he was talking about how in the public, the reaction of both from like media as like, this is reductive and violent and sexist and dangerous. And then he showed some like reactions of American YouTubers that were reacting to this kind of music that didn't really understand the cultural context of like, Boris Johnson, who is that? Is that like the king or something? And talking about how this kind of music is dismissed as being dangerous for the youth, but when you actually interview the people making it, they're like, this music is just reflecting my reality.
Yeah, this is what I live.
Yeah, which is part of...
And it sucks, and I don't like it, but it's what it is, and I need to express that.
Yeah, and that's part of the sort of the conversations around we're again working class fighting amongst each other rather than saying, why are we in these conditions in the first place? You're putting the blame on the people that were put into this situation by the people in power. Like the same thing with conversations in Goth around we end up fighting for resources for like venues or event nights, fighting for resources for who can do what venue, or people fighting among each other, like who's the goth that you should listen to, who's this and that, when they're ignoring, like, first of all, who is being excluded from the conversation. And then also stuff like when it comes to fighting for resources for venues, it's not our fault. We shouldn't be fighting each other. The problem are the hedge fund managers and the you know, whoever that are raising the property value, inflating the property value so they can buy everything out. But what the narrative ends up being is, especially if it's black people, reducing it to the stereotypes of the loud and the violent and the drug addicts and that kind of thing. I don't know how we got there from what we were listening to, but you know, whatever. All right, let's see if we can skip to something else here.
See if we can get something where Lisa's talking, because Lisa had some good points. And I haven't.
Yeah, they didn't let her
So much
talk very
time.
much, unfortunately. That's
too-
us. That doesn't.
so-
no,
I
that's
was
not.
still listening to the music. I was, still going
This
to see
is
the bands live.
aging and is it still relevant today?
Punk.
Which we
Okay.
did.
There we go.
We did an episode on that. Let me scoot back a little bit. We did an episode on aging and goth. If you haven't listened to it, it's very, very good. You should go
Yeah,
check it out.
that was a good
In
that was an
the
enjoyable one to
80s,
do.
and
One of our better ones, I think. Edward from
you've been-
Nervous Gender was on that, who is an absolute legend, and I'm proud to say
I guess
he's.
the museum
okay, here
has
we go.
kind of two collections essentially that we work with, and on the one side we have about 150 photographers that have all documented youth culture.
That really does
A
look
lot
like
of
Cat.
times those people were part of the subcultures and they were documenting them, and they really span from the 60s to the present day. But we realized when we wanted to tell 100 years of growing up, we weren't going to be able to tell all those different stories and all those different experiences just through the photographers. So what we started doing is doing this kind of public call out, saying, you've been young, therefore you can be part of the Museum of Youth Culture. And a lot of the stories that
I like
we
that
get
you
in
said
are
that there.
subcultural.
It's not that you are young,
I
it's that
think
you've
people
been
are really
young.
proud of that past and that story.
Yes.
So you have something to say because everybody's lived this, everyone's experienced this, so everyone has something to do with youth culture.
She is fantastic. The interviews I watched with her, she would say things like that. She would talk about how a lot of the existing record keeping of subcultures in England specifically were always like they're white people, and she's like, our goal was we wanted to incorporate the real experiences of people of color that were in the scene and creating the scene with us that are largely ignored. So I think fantastic. She should have gotten more time to talk. Everybody should go
The
check her
photograph
out.
you can see here is Debbie, who I was chatting about a bit earlier, who has that photograph that they submitted for who they are today as well. But the nice thing about the Grown Up in Britain campaign is that we get these personal stories. So for example, someone like Ian here, he sent this amazing set of photographs that were all about living in a housing cooperative in southeast London in the 80s. And whilst a lot of the photographs in his collection were of kind of goths, because he himself identified as a goth, it was also about their wider group of friends and the place of goth subculture in 80s subcultures, because I think especially in Britain, the 80s, because of the turmoil that Catherine was speaking about earlier, because of Thatcherism, because of a lot of kind of industrial decline, there was a huge kind of uptake of subcultures, and I think in many ways the 80s were
there's an interesting
incredibly
thing,
creative and powerful.
when you're talking about the sort of time of turmoil in the 80s and how there were all these sort of the sensation of strange bedfellows even. And, we've talked on the podcast about hearing people talk about club life back then and how it wasn't this siloed, this is an industrial night, this is an 80s night, this is a pop bar. It was just like, this is an alternative bar and it'll play a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And not everybody loved that. We saw that when we were doing the Italian Goth episode, where everyone would be sort of going to the same clubs, but you'd have, you'd have the punks going out there and really enjoying one thing and then getting off the floor when they start putting in some more gothy or new wave type stuff, and kind of bitching about it, but still being there. They weren't necessarily, not everyone is happy about all the music that's being played, but they tolerate it because it is this moment of being together, this moment of solidarity, and there's this bigger picture of things that is an grievance to everybody. And we kind of see that today too. It depends on the size of any particular scene. If for those of you who are in a scene, smaller scenes are more likely to have maybe one night that tries to cater to a large group of people. Might have a metal night or a goth night or the pervasive goth industrial night, which is its own holdover from the 80s of, there's always a question of why are these two musics still played together? And there are some venues that do like to separate them out. But they are oftentimes put together, and the same thing that I was just discussing that happened in the 80s happens at those clubs in my experience, where you'll have the goths that come out and swarm when Bela Lugosi's Dead is playing, and then Front 242's Headhunter will come up and all of them will sort of wander off, and you'll see the Rivet Heads come out and stomp around to their stuff and then go off again when Dead Can Dance comes on. You'll have another group coming out with Dead Can Dance that are more the sort of swoopy, ethereal goths rather than the trad or the industrial. But you'll also have little bits and pieces here and there of, the eye and the yin yang of the one Rivet Head who stays out there for Dead Can Dance, and the one trad goth that's out there dancing to Combat Christ or whatever happens to be there for a harder edge.
Hopefully not Combat Christ anymore.
Hopefully not, but not everyone pays attention to the social issues related to bands being played.
Okay, that doesn't matter. Well, let's finish this up and let's wrap up this thing, because I would like to do other things today. And then just to again say, this is like, we're recording this immediately after we had some food, but immediately after this. So these are just kind of our off the top of our head thoughts. I think when I get a chance, I don't know if you'll watch this over, but when I sit down and watch this over and we have future discussions on the podcast, more little tidbits of conversation and things will come up. And so if you are only watching this because, if this is live, if it goes up on YouTube, if you're only watching this because it was related to the thing, go check out Cemetery Confessions. We'll have some more stuff to say in the future.
Yeah.
In terms of what young people were doing and how they were expressing themselves and responding to this new politics by creating youth culture and subculture movements, whether that is kind of the emergence of post-punk and goth, down to kind of the Manchester scene, and how ravers started taking over these old industrial spaces and reclaiming them in some way. So what you really start seeing through these public submissions is essentially a social history of the UK that doesn't look at the politics and the big events, but actually looks at how people experienced what was going on at the time and experienced those social changes, really.
Yeah. That's really, really helpful context. Also, I can imagine it's such a rich archive to have all of this together, also understanding the context properly. I think there's another question coming up. Okay.
Oh, that's a good point about just a fun aside. There were two funny question related things. At one point they put in the chat, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I wasn't watching the chat, but just under that, somebody put, if your Uncle Jack helps you off a horse, would you help your Uncle Jack off a horse? Which was just like somebody trolling, which I thought was fucking hilarious. And then at the very end, like when they were trying to wrap up, they took another question, and it was the most ridiculous. Like, what was the question? Do you remember? Let me see if I can find it.
I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was one of those big, huge existential questions that is debated in subcultural circles. I mean, it was about the subculture as a whole.
Yeah, somebody in Discord was like, hey, I know you're trying to wrap up the show, but can I ask you a question that's about literally everything?
Yeah, I mean, it's like someone coming in. It was almost of the same caliber as, how do you define goth as a question as we were wrapping up?
Yeah.
But the one I wanted to mention
Anyway.
was actually right at the beginning, because as you could see, as Danny said, there were questions that were happening in a chat, but most of us in the panel here, I mean, Danny and I weren't really watching the chat. Obviously, the 4 people here in the museum exhibit itself weren't close enough to any screen to actively be paying attention to a chat. So they had moderators that were moderating and monitoring the chat. And then when Emma would come out and say, "Oh, were there any questions?" somebody was picking from the chat ones to put up there. And the very first question that was asked, went through moderation, was, "Hey Nick, I like that mug behind you. Where did you get it?" And it's like,
Why?
what moderator chose that question?
Oh my God.
That is a cute question, sure. And I was a little bit concerned when that was the first question that appeared with, "Oh boy, what am I getting into?" Thankfully,
I feel
that was the only one that
Yeah.
was that jarring. There were a couple that, Emma did a good job of saying,
I felt
we're
so
going to
bad for
address
her.
that. We're going to address that later. So put a pin in it, but we will talk to that question as an answer to another question. That was great that she was doing that. But that first question did not.
No.
Thankfully, it was an invalid impression, but it gave me a very disconcerted first impression. There's that
Yeah.
bloody line.
Yeah. I felt so bad for Emma that she had to deal with that. And it was just, you're right. It was right when we had gotten finally through the introductions. We were just starting to get into the first
Actual
topic.
content. Yeah.
And then they're like, "Oh, we have a question." Why did you put?
Where
Anyway,
did you get that
it
mug?
doesn't matter.
It's like, what?
Thanks. My hair is a mess. That's okay. Listen to Cemetery Confessions. Have a good night. Where's the stop?